Dan Markel had two things the Adelson family wanted gone: legal custody of his children and the refusal to disappear quietly. They had one thing he didn't: enough money to make problems vanish permanently. On July 18, 2014, $100,000 in blood money bought a father's execution. It took 11 years, but justice finally caught up with every single person who thought wealth could buy the perfect murder. Renowned Florida State University law professor Dan Markel was gunned down in his own garage by two men who had driven 500 miles specifically to kill him. The murder weapon? A rental car's anonymity and a carefully planned execution. The motive? A bitter custody battle that a wealthy family decided to end with bullets instead of lawyers. This isn't just another murder-for-hire case. This is the story of how a family's hatred turned deadly, how a mother's love for her daughter became a death sentence for her ex-husband, and how an 11-year investigation slowly unraveled one of the most shocking family conspiracies in recent memory. From the moment Dan Markel pulled into his driveway that July morning, his fate was sealed. The question wasn't whether he would die, it was how long it would take investigators to prove that his own former family had signed his death warrant. Dan Markel pulled into his Tallahassee garage that Friday morning with no idea he had minutes left to live. The 41-year-old law professor had just finished his morning routine, the normal Friday activities of someone planning a weekend with his two young sons. But 500 miles away in Miami, two men had already been driving for hours. Sigfrido Garcia and Luis Rivera weren't heading to Tallahassee for vacation or business. They were coming to kill someone they'd never met, for money paid by people who'd never gotten their own hands dirty. As Dan's garage door closed behind him, those two men were already in his neighborhood, sitting in a rented silver Toyota Prius, waiting for exactly this moment. What happened next would take less than a minute but would launch an investigation that wouldn't end for 11 years. The hitmen approached Dan's car. Shots were fired. Dan was struck in the head, left bleeding in his own garage while his killers calmly walked back to their rental car and started the long drive back to Miami. Dan didn't die immediately. He survived long enough to be discovered, to be rushed to the hospital, to give his family 14 agonizing hours of hope that he might make it. But the bullets had done their work. By that evening, Dan Markel was dead, and investigators were facing a murder that made no sense. Why would anyone want to kill a law professor? Dan wasn't wealthy, didn't have enemies in the criminal world, wasn't involved in anything that would motivate strangers to execute him in his garage. But as detectives started digging into his life, they discovered something that would explain everything. Dan Markel's most dangerous enemy was his own former family. Dan spent his career teaching law students about justice and fairness. When he was murdered, it wasn't by criminals he'd prosecuted or students he'd failed, it was because his former in-laws decided he was an inconvenient obstacle to their family plans. While Dan was building his academic career in Tallahassee, the Adelson family was building an empire in South Florida: dental practices, real estate, the kind of wealth that makes problems disappear with checkbooks. But Dan Markel represented a problem that money couldn't solve the usual way. Donna Adelson, the family matriarch, had one obsession: keeping her daughter Wendy and her grandchildren close to the family in South Florida. When Wendy's marriage to Dan ended in divorce, Donna expected a simple solution: Wendy would move back to Miami with the children, and life would return to normal. Except Dan said no. As a father with legal custody rights, he refused to let his ex-wife relocate his children 500 miles away, effectively cutting him out of their daily lives. To the Adelsons, this was unacceptable. To Dan, this was basic parental responsibility. The custody battle that followed wasn't just expensive, it was becoming clear that Dan wouldn't back down. Courts weren't going to force him to surrender his parental rights, and legal avenues weren't going to give the Adelsons what they wanted. At some point in 2014, someone in that family decided there was another solution. A permanent one. Charlie Adelson, Wendy's brother and a successful periodontist, became the family's problem solver. Unlike his parents, Charlie moved in circles where illegal solutions weren't unthinkable. His relationship with Catherine Magbanua, a former stripper with connections to the Miami underworld, gave him access to people who would do things for money that legitimate businesses wouldn't touch. But here's what made this conspiracy particularly cold-blooded: the Adelsons didn't just want Dan gone. They wanted it done in a way that would never trace back to them. They needed middlemen, buffers, and people willing to commit murder without knowing who was really paying for it. Catherine Magbanua became the crucial link between the Adelson family's money and the street criminals willing to kill for cash. She had 2 children with Sigfrido Garcia, one of the men who would eventually pull the trigger on Dan. This personal relationship meant she could approach Garcia about a murder contract without raising the suspicions that come from strangers offering criminal work. Garcia wasn't a professional hitman, he was a small-time criminal from Miami willing to commit murder for the right price. His partner Luis Rivera was essentially along for his share of the payment. Neither man had any connection to Dan Markel, any knowledge of why the Adelson family wanted him dead, or any reason to care beyond the money they'd been promised. The fact that the Adelsons used amateur killers instead of professionals would eventually become crucial to solving the case. Real hitmen would have been more expensive but also more careful and harder to trace. Garcia and Rivera's inexperience would leave a trail that patient investigators could follow back to everyone involved. By early summer 2014, the pieces were in place. Charlie Adelson had the money. Catherine Magbanua had the connection to the killers. Garcia and Rivera had the willingness to commit murder for cash. All they needed was the right moment when Dan would be alone and vulnerable. The conspiracy was simple in its brutality: drive to Tallahassee, wait for Dan to come home alone, kill him in his garage where there would be no witnesses, and drive back to Miami before anyone even knew what happened. Clean, quick, and supposedly untraceable to the wealthy family who had orchestrated everything. What the conspirators didn't count on was that in the modern world, murder leaves traces. Rental car records, phone call patterns, financial transactions, surveillance cameras, all of it creates evidence that skilled investigators can piece together. The Adelson family's wealth and Charlie's careful planning ultimately couldn't protect them from the basic reality that murder is hard to hide in the digital age. When Tallahassee police arrived at Dan Markel's home on July 18, they knew immediately this wasn't random violence. Executions in upscale neighborhoods don't happen by accident. Someone had wanted Dan dead badly enough to plan it carefully. The garage told the story: spent shell casings, blood evidence, and the positioning of Dan's car all indicated a targeted hit. This wasn't a robbery interrupted or a home invasion gone wrong. Someone had waited for Dan to come home alone, had known his routine well enough to strike at the perfect moment. But the killers had made their first mistake. Neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar silver Toyota Prius in the area around the time of the shooting. In a residential neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's cars, a rental vehicle stuck out. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes captured the Prius arriving, waiting, and leaving shortly after the gunshots. Within hours, investigators had a partial license plate. Within days, they'd traced it to a Miami rental agency. And within weeks, they had a name: Sigfrido Garcia. The question wasn't just who killed Dan anymore, it was why someone from Miami would drive 500 miles to execute a Tallahassee law professor. The answer would take years to fully unravel, but the first threads were already visible. Garcia's name opened the investigation wide. Phone records showed he'd been in contact with Catherine Magbanua before and after the murder. Financial records showed unusual cash movements that coincided with the timing of Dan's death. The rental car created a paper trail that amateur killers hadn't thought to cover. But the real breakthrough came from following the money backward. Magbanua had received payments from Charlie Adelson, Dan's former brother-in-law. Those payments were substantial, regular, and their timing matched perfectly with the murder timeline. Suddenly, the murder made sense. This wasn't random gang violence or mistaken identity. This was a family hit, ordered by wealthy in-laws who had decided custody court was taking too long. Investigators now faced a delicate challenge. They had evidence connecting street criminals to a murder, and financial records suggesting wealthy family involvement, but they needed proof that would hold up in court against defendants who could afford the best lawyers money could buy. More than a year after Dan's murder, with suspects identified but not enough evidence for arrests, the FBI launched an operation that would eventually crack the case wide open. They created a fictional scenario. Undercover agents posed as criminals who claimed to know about the Adelson family's involvement in Dan's murder. They contacted Donna Adelson directly, threatening to expose the family unless they received payment to stay quiet. This was brilliant investigative work. An innocent person would have been confused, would have immediately contacted police, would have had no idea what murder these supposed extortionists were talking about. But Donna's response revealed everything. She engaged with the extortionists. She called them back multiple times. She discussed the murder in ways that showed she understood exactly what they were referencing. Most damning of all, she acted like someone who knew she was guilty and was trying to manage a threat, not someone who was confused by false accusations. Every phone call was recorded. Every word Donna said would later be played in courtroom, her own voice proving her knowledge of the murder conspiracy. The FBI had given the Adelsons enough rope, and Donna had used it to hang herself. Imagine being so confident that money can solve any problem that when extortionists call claiming to know about your murder conspiracy, you negotiate with them instead of calling the police. That's exactly what Donna Adelson did, and those recordings would eventually convict her. Luis Rivera broke first. Facing overwhelming evidence and a potential death penalty, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided insider details about how the murder was planned, how much money changed hands, and who had coordinated everything. Garcia's arrest followed, but unlike Rivera, he chose to fight the charges. He maintained his innocence despite the rental car records, phone logs, and financial evidence tying him directly to Dan's execution. His trial would eventually end with conviction and life in prison. Catherine Magbanua was next. As the crucial link between the Adelson money and the street killers, she faced charges as serious as the men who had pulled the trigger. She'd enabled the murder, coordinated the timing, and helped facilitate payment. Her conviction came with a life sentence, no parole, no second chances. But investigators weren't done. They wanted the people who had ordered the hit, not just the hired help who had carried it out. They wanted the Adelsons. Charlie Adelson wasn't arrested until April 2022, nearly 8 years after his former brother-in-law's murder. Those 8 years weren't because investigators didn't suspect him. They were because building a case against a wealthy periodontist with top-tier lawyers required evidence so overwhelming that no jury could ignore it. During those 8 years, Charlie lived his life. He practiced dentistry, made money, socialized with friends, and probably believed that his careful planning had insulated him from consequences. After all, he'd never met the hitmen personally, had used Magbanua as a buffer, and had been careful about direct communication. But modern investigations don't need direct evidence when they have phone records, financial transactions, and cooperating witnesses. The case against Charlie was being built piece by piece, transaction by transaction, phone call by phone call. When Charlie was finally arrested in April 2022, the evidence against him was devastating. Phone records showed he'd been in constant contact with Magbanua around the time of the murder. Financial records showed he'd made substantial payments to her that couldn't be explained by their relationship. Testimony from Rivera and other cooperating witnesses placed him at the center of the murder conspiracy. It took 8 years to arrest Charlie and 11 years to convict his mother. If you appreciate the detective work that brought the Adelson family to justice, subscribe. We follow these cases from murder to conviction, no matter how long it takes. Charlie's trial in November 2023 was damning. Prosecutors presented a clear narrative. Charlie had coordinated Dan's murder to solve his family's custody problem, had used Magbanua to hire the killers, and had paid for everything with family money. The jury deliberated and returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Donna Adelson's trial began on August 22, 2025, more than 11 years after she'd allegedly helped orchestrate her former son-in-law's murder. At 75 years old, she faced the rest of her life in prison if convicted. The prosecution's case centered on those FBI undercover recordings. Donna's own voice, captured on tape, showed knowledge of the murder conspiracy and concern about being caught. Her statements to the extortionists revealed guilt in ways that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. Prosecutors also presented evidence of Donna's hatred for Dan and her obsession with having Wendy and the grandchildren nearby. Witnesses testified about conversations where Donna had spoken about Dan with pure venom, viewing him as an obstacle that needed to be removed. The defense faced an impossible task. How do you explain away your client's statements to undercover FBI agents? How do you convince a jury that someone innocent would engage with supposed extortionists about a murder instead of calling police? During the trial, Donna clashed repeatedly with the judge. These confrontations revealed a woman accustomed to getting her way, frustrated by circumstances beyond her control. The tensions became so visible that Donna's lawyers advised her not to testify. Her courtroom demeanor might do more damage than her silence. On September 4, 2025, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Conspiracy to commit murder. Solicitation of murder. The grandmother who had orchestrated her former son-in-law's execution would spend the rest of her life in prison. Donna Adelson will die in prison, convicted by her own recorded words admitting knowledge of the murder she'd helped plan. But Dan's two sons still grew up without their father. Is this justice, or just the least terrible outcome after an irreversible tragedy? As of late 2025, two Adelsons have never been charged: Wendy Adelson, Dan's ex-wife, and Harvey Adelson, the family patriarch. Their absence from the defendant's table raises uncomfortable questions about whether justice has truly been served. Wendy benefited most directly from Dan's death. She was finally free to move to South Florida with the children without custody restrictions. She'd been in contact with her family throughout the murder planning period. Yet prosecutors have never charged her, suggesting either insufficient evidence or strategic decisions about which family members to pursue. Harvey Adelson's role remains equally murky. As the family patriarch and source of the wealth that funded the murder, his involvement seems likely but has never been proven in court. Whether he actively participated in planning Dan's death or simply provided the money his family used remains unknown. These gaps in accountability haunt Dan's family and friends. While the main conspirators face life sentences, others who may have known about or enabled the murder remain free. 11 years after Dan Markel's murder, 5 people have been convicted: Luis Rivera, the hitman who cooperated, serving reduced federal sentence, soon to be released. Sigfrido Garcia, the triggerman, convicted of first-degree murder, life in prison. Catherine Magbanua, the go-between who made it all possible, life in prison. Charlie Adelson, the operational coordinator, life plus 60 years. Donna Adelson, the matriarch who helped orchestrate everything, life in prison. The investigation consumed thousands of hours, cost millions of dollars, and required patience that tested everyone involved. But ultimately, modern forensics, patient detective work, and the conspirators' own mistakes brought everyone to justice. The case proves that wealthy defendants with top lawyers can still be convicted when evidence is overwhelming and prosecutors are patient. The Adelson family's money bought them years of freedom, but it couldn't buy acquittal when the evidence was this damning. Dan Markel should be remembered for more than his murder. He was a brilliant legal scholar whose work on criminal justice reform influenced policy nationwide. He was a devoted father who died fighting for the right to raise his children. His refusal to surrender his custody rights wasn't stubbornness, it was love. He believed fathers mattered in children's lives, and he was willing to fight legal battles to prove it. His murder revealed the darkest possibilities of family disputes when unlimited money meets moral bankruptcy. The Adelson family had every resource necessary to fight custody battles through legal channels. They chose murder instead, valuing their convenience over human life. Dan's legacy also demonstrates the power of thorough investigation. The case seemed impossible to solve: no witnesses to the actual shooting, professional-seeming execution, wealthy defendants with resources to fight charges. Yet investigators never gave up, and eventually the evidence became overwhelming. Phone records, financial transactions, surveillance footage, and undercover recordings created an evidence web that even expensive lawyers couldn't untangle. The digital age makes murder harder to hide, even for those with unlimited resources. If you believe the fight for justice in cases like Dan Markel's must never be forgotten, subscribe. We expose the stories that demand answers. The Adelson family's wealth bought them time, but it couldn't erase the evidence trail they'd created. Dan Markel deserved to live, to continue his groundbreaking legal work, and to raise his sons. His death was preventable, if the Adelsons had chosen lawyers over hitmen, if they'd valued human life over family convenience, if they'd accepted that custody battles don't justify murder, but they made different choices, and those choices cost them everything. Donna Adelson will die in prison. Charlie Adelson will never practice dentistry again. Garcia and Magbanua will spend their lives behind bars. And Dan's sons will grow up knowing their father was murdered by their own family over a custody dispute. The case file on Dan Markel's murder is now closed. Every major conspirator has been convicted and sentenced. Justice took 11 years, but it arrived for everyone involved in planning and executing Dan's death. The law professor who spent his career teaching about justice finally received it, 11 years late, but complete. Thank you for watching.